Paul writing to the Romans, Romans 1, beginning at verse 9. God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be opened for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. I am obligated, both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You know, you gotta admire a guy who loves his work. I mean, here's Paul. He's an apostle. That's another word for missionary. He's been a follower of Jesus for something over 20 years now. It's probably about the year 57 or 58 AD, somewhere in there. And Paul was converted in the late 30s of the first century, not so long after the crucifixion. And since about the third day after his conversion, if you know his story, he's been a minister of the gospel. That's been his life's work. Sometimes he's earned a living by working on the side to support himself, but primarily his work was to take this message that had so changed him about Jesus Christ out into the world. And here, 20 years later, he's still going strong. And believe me, Paul had a lot of miles on his chassis. I mean, these were not easy years. Somebody has estimated that he must have walked 3,000 to 4,000 miles in the course of doing it. He sailed in these leaky little ships that would be subject to storm and shipwreck, hunger, cold, danger on the road, terrible places to stay, sleeping out in the open. And time after time, in place after place, the mob would get angry at him, usually for religious reasons, and he'd be beaten up, or he'd be stoned, or he'd be thrown into jail, or he'd be kicked out of town. That was his life. You might have thought by this point, you know, Paul's looking forward to retirement. He's ready to hang it up. He's done his share. You know, look for a nice condo on the beach, maybe. He didn't know about the Treasure Coast, but I think Greece has some pretty nice beaches. He had traveled through Greece, play a little golf, go fishing, relax, take it easy. And instead, here he is, probably toward the end of his third missionary journey. He took these successive great journeys through the world by foot, by sail. Toward the end, he's writing to a church in a new city, Rome, that he had never been to before. And he's telling them how much he wants to come, how eager he is to come and share with them too. Why is the question that I've puzzled about. Why? What made him so passionate about sharing this message? In fact, if you read Romans, he didn't just want to go to Rome. He wanted them to give him some money so that he could eventually go on to Spain. He wanted to go to the end of the world as they knew it in order to kind of reach out into new territory with the message about Jesus? Well, I think I see 5 reasons here in these verses for Paul's eagerness to preach the gospel. I'm going to say a little bit about the first 4, but I want to focus on the last one. But here's the first one. It's in verse 9. God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you. So for Paul, this work of preaching that he did was part of his worship of God. He did it out of service to the Lord. Later in Romans, he would talk about how each of us can do that. I appeal to you, he would write, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is your spiritual worship. This isn't just lip service. This isn't just going through the motions. For Paul, the work that he did was his offering of worship. We don't just worship here when we gather and stand and sing, as wonderful as that is. We worship tomorrow when we go about our daily business. And we worship in particular when we talk about Jesus. That's part of our worship. Here's the second reason Paul gives. It's in verse 11. God, he says, I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. See, Paul, in sharing God's word, wanted to do that in Rome because he knew that it would strengthen them and their faith. It is the ministry of God's word, especially as it's preached. This is a funny thing. I don't understand how it works or why it works either. You'd think that just some random guy standing up and talking for 20 or 30 minutes wouldn't amount to much. But what God's people have discovered down through the centuries is that in listening again to the gospel, our faith is strengthened. And Paul says it's mutual. You're going to strengthen me and I'm going to strengthen you. Somehow, have you heard that? You've heard this phrase, right? Oh, you're just preaching to the choir. You're just preaching to the choir. As if that's a waste of time. Friends, the choir needs preaching too. You know? The world has a way of chipping away at our faith, of kind of nibbling at it, sometimes battering it. Something happens and wow. It's hard to believe. It's hard to continue believing. Can I still believe in God after that? Or we sort of drift along and we kind of get out of the habit. But gathering together week by week and opening this book and just listening to what it says to us has a way of strengthening, doesn't it? Building faith back up. I know I need it. I'm eager to preach mostly because I listen to it myself. And I find every time I hear the gospel, you can't get it too often. Okay? You know, tell me the old story. Tell me the old story. Every time I hear it, I find my heart warmed again. And my faith somehow encouraged and strengthened. That's why. That's why he was eager to preach. Here's a third reason. Paul says here in verse 13, toward the end, I wanted to come for a long time now. Something has always come up and prevented me, but now at last I think I'm going to make it there. Little did he know what still lay ahead of him before he would actually get to Rome. You can read about it in the book of Acts. But I want to come so that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. Paul knew that whenever the gospel was preached, it would meet a mixed reaction. Some people would say, that's just stupid. Jesus, all that Jesus stuff. But others would believe it. I wonder, has that happened to you? You heard this message about Jesus and his cross, and somehow something in you opened your heart and you believed it. And that's what turned Paul on. He loved seeing people come alive to God through Christ. He loved the idea of a harvest, that there were people out there just waiting, and all they needed to do was hear the good news, and they would respond, they would believe it, they would accept it. It wasn't that Paul was all that great. Well, he was, but that wasn't the key. The key was that God did something. And whenever this message is shared, somehow, in some way, beyond our understanding, Jesus put it this way: my sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah, they become his sheep by following him, but even before they start to follow, he knows who they are. And when his voice is heard, his sheep will follow. There'll be a harvest. What am I up to? Number 4. How are we doing? Are you still with me? Okay. Because I can skip 4 and just cut to the chase. I love 4, though. I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. And then he adds verse 15, that is why I'm eager to preach the gospel to you who are also in Rome. I'm obligated. Obligation. What does that mean? That word suggests a debt that you owe, an obligation. You sign a loan, you've got an obligation to repay. You may try to get out of it, but trouble will follow. Obligation. And see, I love the way this works. I think the obligation that Paul felt was because he received the gospel. He experienced the grace of God freely as a gift. He didn't earn it. He didn't deserve it. It wasn't a right for him. It was a gift. See, your paycheck is a right. You've earned that. You deserve it. You worked for it. It's yours. Take it. Spend it. Do what you want with it. But a gift lays on you, on me, a debt of gratitude, doesn't it? Why do we teach our kids from this high, say thank you to Grandma. Grandma gave you some nice thing. What do you say? What do you say? It comes hard. It comes hard to us because we like to think everything we get is a right. Everything is a right. It's mine. But not a gift. So here's the question. Is God's grace a right or is it a gift? Is salvation a right? Have you earned it? Or is it a gift? Have you simply received it? If it's a gift, then we owe a debt of gratitude. And Paul suggests that what you do with a debt of gratitude is pay it forward. You know that old line, Woody Hayes, I think? You can't pay it back, but you can pay it forward. I'm obligated, Paul says, to everybody. Everybody. Jews, Greeks, rich, poor, smart, ignorant, you name it. I feel this wonderful debt for what God has done for me. Do you know anything about Paul? Paul was a persecutor of the first Christians. Paul thought he was doing God a favor by hunting him down and throwing him in prison. And then all of a sudden, while he's on the way, a light shines from heaven, and Jesus made himself known to Paul in compassion and love, and Paul was struck down, and he never forgot it. This wasn't ego that was driving him to keep preaching, keep going, keep serving. It wasn't ego. Paul's ego had largely gone away. Ego, I, is the Greek word. Ego is the Greek word for I. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. Here it comes. Who loved me and gave himself for me. Wow. It's a gift. I'm under obligation to everyone everywhere to share the same gift. Here's the last reason, and in many ways it's, I think, the best and the fullest. And it comes in verses 16 and 17, where Paul explains his eagerness to preach really springs from his understanding of what the gospel really is and what it really does. What the gospel really is and what it really does. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written. Then he quotes from the Old Testament book of Habakkuk, the righteous will live by faith. I'm not going to try to say everything about these verses and these words, because I hope to be able to unpack this more and more in coming weeks if you hang in there. But notice this. Notice the little connecting words in these verses, because Paul is explaining why the gospel is such a big deal. I'm not ashamed of it, he says. I'm not ashamed of it. Would you be ashamed of the gospel? Why would you be? But we know very well what that's like, don't we? We live in a shaming culture now. It's getting worse and worse. Social media has become, for many people, a shaming device. Politics shaming, body shaming, faith shaming, going on all the time, isn't it? Shame is a tool that people use for social control. Keep unwanted opinions out of circulation. Just shame it so you keep quiet. Unwanted ideas. The gospel is so countercultural, especially in our day. Our time likes a kind of vague spirituality, but the gospel is specific and precise. Our age says it doesn't really matter what you believe, you can believe anything. The gospel says, no, you have to believe this, this, and this. This really happened. Our gospel is easy, our culture is easygoing and tolerant. We all get this, don't we? We see it all around us. The gospel says Jesus is the only way to God. And our culture says, come again? What? Years ago, I was driving down an interstate, and I noticed a bumper sticker on a car next to me that said, I'm straight but not narrow. Okay, I get it. I'm straight but not narrow. The straight and narrow, we talk about the straight and narrow. But that started me thinking about that phrase. It comes from the Sermon on the Mount. But it comes really as a bit of a distortion. Because if you look at the old King James Bible, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, straight is the gate and narrow is the way that leads unto life, and few there be that find it. Except straight is not S-T-R-A-I-G-H-T. It's S-T-R-A-I-T. You follow? A straight, S-T-R-A-I-T, is a narrow place. What Jesus is saying is the gate is narrow and the way is narrow. It's narrow. You can't be a Christian without entering through that narrow gate and walking on that narrow way. And that is offensive to people today. But I'm not ashamed of it, says Paul. Why? Because, here comes the next phrase, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. It is the power of God. It's not sort of about the power of God. The message is the power. And the gospel carries in itself, by the power of the Spirit of God, the ability to save. Because, Paul goes on, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. A righteousness that's by faith from beginning to end. And now we come to the heart of it. Salvation demands righteousness. Righteousness in the sight of God. Tim Keller, the great pastor and preacher from New York City, Redeemer Presbyterian Church, speaks of righteousness in terms of a validating performance record. I like that. It sounds a little daunting, but bear with me here. Validating performance record. We all know what that is and how that works because that's the way the world operates. You want to get into the best school, you need a validating performance record. You need the grade point, you need the test scores, and nowadays if you want to go Ivy League, you better have started in preschool, and you have to be showing all kinds of extracurricular activities, and it helps if you started your own nonprofit by the time you're in your mid-teens, that sort of thing. Validating performance record. We know all about them. Or you want to get a good job, you better have a resume. Or you're not even going to get an interview, right? Validating performance. Or the NFL Combine's going on right now. What is that? Except a validating performance record, because college film is all well and good, but that's not enough. We want to know how high your vertical is, what's your wingspan, how fast do you run the 40, spring training, what is that? Validating performance record. You want to make the show? You better be able to hit a curveball. That's how the world works. And it's constantly sifting people. You're in, you're out, you're out, you're out, you're out. You might be in. And that's how people approach God, basically. The difference is they put the bar really low. Hey, you're not Hitler? Okay, you're in. That's good enough. But God is holiness personified. And His demand is for perfect righteousness. You and I can never do enough to validate ourselves in God's eyes. And yet we try. I led a pretty good life. I didn't beat my wife. I tried, And God says, I'll give you a better way. Jesus is our validating performance record. He lived the life. He did what was needed. He even paid the price at the cross for all our sins. And God says, do you want him or don't you? That's what faith is all about. Faith is The key, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. If you want to make it a right, you want salvation to be your paycheck, then you better get busy and try to earn it. But God says, I offer it to you as a gift to be received by faith.